As before, I'll open it up now. This time it would be nice if I can not start. If anyone wants to jump in and ask questions to one another, I'll leave you to it, or even any comments that you might have on things that you've seen.
I have a question. I'm curious about your tech co-op business. What's that about?
A lot of the tech stuff is pretty simple and has already been built for other housing tenures. So, for instance, lots of people have automated property management for property managers, but no one's ever automated property managers because within the incentive of a landlord-tenant power relationship, no one's going to do extra work if they can be kicked out at any time. But professional property management firms don't do it the same way they did it in the 90s. They do it through APIs, being able to use photos to get a link out to the right tradesperson. We're taking some of that technology, but the starting point is there is a co-op, and then rather than co-ops having to rely on bits of paper, we can use some of the stuff that already exists, repackage it for cooperative housing, give it to them. But the magic bit isn't the tech, the magic bit is co-ops, and lots of them. Once you have that power structure, then you can do some interesting, for instance, there are some, I'll not talk for too long, there's some regulatory advantages in the UK where within a housing cooperative it can do things like borrow against its future rent to retrofit a building. So you could feasibly say, oh, maybe we want a heat pump. It is now possible to say, well, your rent will go up by £15 per person per month, but the payback will be X. You can formally vote on that and have a record of it, and then you can have an API call to a retrofit company. None of this is it's not trivial, but it's not technically very difficult. The cool bit is the co-op. So we want lots of co-ops, and then you can add tech. But if you do it the other way around, then it's just tragic.
Yeah, okay, interesting.
Any questions? I will just then maybe touch on a topic that has been, of course, emerging already from the morning, and wonder whether anyone wants to sort of contribute any thoughts. Is this kind of specter of institutionalization and hierarchy that somehow is in there. In some cases, when we look at the Toronto example, of course, it's really where the question of sides pops in, right? Today we've encountered from the 4 members of the smallest co-op that was speaking in the morning to the 800 and over people living in that building, passing through the 100 in Edinburgh and so on. So size somehow matters, and so I wonder how much size really is also a hinder to the possibility of proper cooperation as a flat horizontal structure, or whether, as you were, even Celeste, as you were touching upon, maybe that's just a myth that we have, and it's not really a sort of a reality, a possibility. So there will inevitably always be some form of a hierarchy that is necessary to run groups in the moment in which the groups become big. As you were saying, there are inevitably certain voices that start having a bigger impact than other voices. And is that wrong or right, or is it just inevitable?
I don't know. I don't have a super nuanced answer. I guess this has been very interesting for me, hearing about different sort of ways that work and labour is managed and organised in different co-ops. I mean, I think I guess something that's coming to mind is that I think one of the issues that Edinburgh struggles with is this. So it's everyone is expected to participate. It's not necessarily opt-in. And that factor combines with this super transient membership and the fact that, I don't know, it's funny, the status of being a student is, I guess, very different for different people. There's an idea that being a student, you have loads of free time and you're uniquely positioned in life to kind of do other things. But then for some people, they actually have very little time. So I don't know, I guess I'm thinking of different models from different co-ops such as Sanford, and it was really interesting to hear about the this idea of like being able to opt out of your role by like contributing like payment or like like having like an exchange based. I don't know. I'm not making very much sense, but I think that like some of those issues of like informal hierarchies arising are because of a lack of like appropriate or like relevant sort of structures for managing work, and that I think it's maybe something that because they've been running for 10 years now. Perhaps a like more thorough sort of like update and look at the way that the place is organized is due, just because like as it's been said before, like from the get-go, the co-op was fully there was full membership, and I think they've just like almost been like struggling to I don't know, like just managing to stay afloat for a long time, and it's hard to kind of like peel back and actually really interrogate the structures that underpin everything. Those are just some idle thoughts.
I think in the case of, is this on? Yeah, in the case of like Rochdale, the dogmatic anti-hierarchical view is what caused them to kind of crash and burn. They didn't have like some people to direct them, and it brought in too many voices. And with Neo-Wizig, I think there is a hierarchy, but it's very open for new people to join, and it essentially is based on how much someone wants to contribute that can get into this into the system. So we have board of director meetings. Or you can sign up for board of directors, and some of the board of directors have been there for a very long time, and some are new students that join, and so it allows to have a very diverse voice within that leadership, and then you kind of have people that maybe aren't very like outspoken, but they can have their person representing them, and in that way sort of create a sort of equality. Like it is a structure, but even the new members have a lot of power within that structure. Yeah, I mean, I think another, just with Janet was also going to allude to, is we're now, the pandemic caused a lot of financial problems for Neo-Wizig, and the Neo-Wizig still has a massive mortgage after 50 years of being alive, and I think that's the mortgage kind of helps them continue. And in order to pay back the mortgage, we're looking to increase the rent. And that the last time this happened was a crazy event. I mean, I remember people were like, "Why are we increasing it?" It was a 3% increase from $425 to $470. That's like 225 pounds for one bedroom to like 200, maybe 50. And so today we're like, in a few months they're looking to increase it. And so I think everyone has a voice within those, even those like really intense conversations. Yeah.
Lily, can I ask you, in your interviews that you had with Edinburgh, you told us of the nice stories, but has there been any sort of conflict or tension that emerged out of your conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there were definitely some tales about, things not going well. I think it definitely touched upon the sort of participation as like a big issue that they faced. I mean, it's kind of like life, really. If you're in a team at work, there's always someone who puts in more effort, or at school, there's always someone who like writes most of the report and someone who doesn't. Like, I think it's sort of just like a natural thing in our society. There's always people who put in more effort, people who don't. There's different capacities people have. There's always like, mental health issues, different things going on that not everybody can always be at full productivity at the same time. But then that impacts negatively on those who sort of have to bear the brunt of like the workload, especially for maintenance at Edinburgh. I talked to like a few people who were on their like maintenance working group, and how there's always issues in a house. Think about where you live right now. There's probably like a door that squeaks or like a window that doesn't close. There's always like some things, when you have like 100 rooms that are facing maintenance difficulties, and there's maybe like only a handful of people who are actually efficient and able to fix things, like there's a lot of tension that rises. I remember hearing this one story about they call it like they're like a mold demon that had grown under a sink, and how it just hadn't been reported for about like 10 years since the co-op started, and then they suddenly were like, oh, actually we've had this leak under the sink for like ages, and the guy opened the door and he was like, well, yeah, it's like it's green under here, like no wonder. So that sort of thing of like, again, like one of the quotes in the presentation I did about how there's sort of this shift of going from a tenant mentality to a cooperative member mentality of like, if there's an issue, it's kind of your responsibility to fix it, and empowering students. Because you think a classic student, like, you know, maybe they're 18, they're moving into the co-op, they've lived with their parents up until that point, they've never really had to take autonomy or like even know what autonomy is to them and how to like embrace this new sort of responsibility. So I think it's definitely an interesting dynamic to have a student co-op almost as like a sort of like baby learning experience before you can go on and sort of like learn how it's meant to be done. That's kind of how I perceived it in a way, because lots of members do leave and like have these aspirations of wanting to start their own co-op and like going on to like learning from their experience at Edinburgh. So yeah, definitely some conflicts sort of brought up, but I think it's definitely like, I kind of perceived it as like a learning experience and almost like classic students, you know, kind of figuring out what the hell's going on, which I think, you know, no one's born an expert, so yeah.
I was just going to ask to that, do you think there can be like, as well as hierarchies of power, perhaps hierarchies of knowledge as well? 100%, yeah. So if someone knows how to do something, then they're sort of the only person you can go to ask. Yeah. And they can decide who gets that knowledge, who doesn't, and who they help. That can obviously be a big point of conflict in a lot of co-ops, because especially this comes back to the point of having long-standing members. They tend to have more knowledge, and then that sort of creates that sort of hierarchy in that regard. Not just power, but also, how much information they hold and what they know about the co-op and how it runs.
Sorry, I don't want to hog the mic too much. But yeah, there was this one story that came up about how, but they were renovating the basement, and even the guy who was on at the very beginning talking about how, well, I wasn't around when the basement was created, and when it was going on, like the renovations, they had this whole woodwork workshop that was opened, and like everyone was people were participating and learning how to lay floors, learning how to use all these tools. But obviously, when they graduate, leave the co-op, they now just have this massive workshop of like dangerous like razors and saws, but no one with the knowledge is still there. And I remember that there was like this kind of pressure for like the remaining sort of like, you know, long-term co-opers who knew how to use all these tools, going down to the basement and being like, guys, like, what are you doing? Like, you can't have your hair down using a power tool. You can't, you know, just be careful what you're doing. But that sort of loss of knowledge, and in this case, like kind of safety concerns about what happens when there isn't like a sort of system to pass knowledge down as you're sort of growing a co-op, which I think, you know, is definitely prevalent in any sort of student group. So yeah, it's definitely a good point. Yeah.
Just to add to that, so there wasn't like, I don't think there was an official system in place for that, but there was kind of situations that, I don't know if you were there when our toilets were still broken. We had 2 toilets in our flat, and one of them was broken, and someone knew how to fix toilets, but like broken, like properly like cracked off, like not just like easy broken. But he was like, I'm not going to come and fix this toilet for you. I am going to come and show everyone who lives in this flat how to fix it, and then you guys can do it with my supervision. So kind of that was an attitude as well, definitely. So kind of having that attitude with a lot of things helps it, but there was like no official kind of policy, this is how you pass on knowledge.
I think there's often a question about like which standards are fair to hold this to, and often I like worry that co-ops hold themselves to the standard of being essentially magical beings where everything's absolutely perfect. And I think like one of the challenges of being an intentional community is you're paying loads of attention to hierarchies, and there's always something to improve, but no one's ever, like, this standard of maintenance and quality of life shouldn't be compared to magic. It should be compared perhaps to amateur landlords that students would otherwise have to rely on, and the standards of domestic harmony and fairness and power sharing perhaps should be compared to domestic harmony. When people move out to the suburbs, get a mortgage, have kids, fall out, get divorced and fight over the house, no one goes to the bank and says you have to pay for marriage counselling. Like, it's not seen as a problem if the housing tenure So like it's great to be proactively thinking about this and managing it, but it's also, while this is happening in the context of a housing crisis where things can be much, much worse, I think there's a case to be made that actually co-ops are leading the way in this, and they shouldn't be so lost in self-criticism that we forget to say that there is actually a subculture within the UK housing market where people have security of tenure, it is affordable, and they're healthier and they're happier.
Yeah, and it goes a long way because, you know, Neil Wyzik, you know, being around for 50 years, the rents at Neil Wyzik are like a quarter or almost 20% of what the rent is in the rest of Toronto. And when I moved in, it was not that different. And so, you know, you could move in, but now so many students want to move into this building because the rents everywhere else is unrealistic. But Neil Wyzik has no need to increase rent beyond what needs to survive. And so, yeah, like over a long period of time, this works out to such a benefit of people. I kind of wanted to ask you guys as well, how does knowledge transfer work in Edinburgh? And do students stay only for their student tenure or live on past that?
I mean, the idea is that you just stay while you're studying, but there's pretty like soft kind of rules around that. It's pretty easy to, like, you know, if you extend your studies, or, you know, often this maybe isn't as related, but there has been a lot of cases where people will want to live in the co-op, so they'll apply to do a course with the minimum amount of credits they can, just so they can live in the co-op, which is kind of like a, you know, a comment on itself and on the housing crisis. But yeah, I mean, just to preface what I'll say, like, I just wanted to jump off from what you guys were saying about how I kind of like this idea. I think it's easy to be very critical of how knowledge and skills get sort of lost, or people are constantly having to kind of like reinvent and re-educate themselves in situations like the co-op. But I quite like this approach that it's like that's actually kind of fine, and like seeing it more as a sort of a training ground or a space to experiment and to try new things and to like equip ourselves with the knowledge. Like that's quite, I think that's the power in these environments in itself, really. I think that in terms of the accumulation of knowledge, like in certain, I don't know, maybe I can ask you like more specifically what your question was, like, do you mean in terms of where knowledge is like codified or documents that are made, or like what kind of knowledge, I guess, are you referring to?
I mean, I guess just in general, but even like management of the co-op is quite, you know, it's quite an intense level of knowledge, and also it carries with it accountability. And so how do we hold co-op members accountable that are also volunteering? And I think in the case of Neil Wyzik, it became that there's like staff that are hired to run a lot of the things. The maintenance is now done by, you know, professional maintenance workers, and the participants don't do that stuff, but rather focus on the community events. And you know, that is the benefit of a massive co-op that's been going on for so long. But yeah.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, I have like slight reservations maybe about like the idea of sort of outsourcing like labour within a cooperative setting, just because I don't know if this is like a valid critique, but I guess like certain jobs like have specific, like often they're quite like underpaid or like kind of gendered work, so I think that there is like a real benefit to like everyone kind of like equipping themselves and like trying to do the jobs that like all sorts of different jobs within a space, so that it kind of like removes those kind of hierarchies, and there's structures in place to revolve roles every so often, every year everyone does a new role, or they can change the role if it doesn't feel like it fits them. And a lot of it, honestly, I guess happens just on an interpersonal basis and in meetings. I think that there's like not, I mean, like it was said by Amber at the beginning, but we have like servers and places where information is stored. But I think a lot of it just kind of like is like living knowledge that kind of is passed pretty informally through like socializing and through just knowing each other. I mean, I don't know what you guys think.
No, I think that is true. You mostly, if you want to find something out, you find out who's the person to talk to who knows this. But also, we had quite a rigid note-taking system. So I think for meetings bigger than 3 or 4 people, you were required to take meeting notes. And they were all stored on that server, and there was a system to it. So if you kind of knew how to navigate that online file system, you could also find these notes for every meeting that has ever happened in the co-op. So the information is there. If it's the most accessible way of finding information is a different question, but it's kind of like a mix between this. Talk to people, find the people who know where stuff is, and like dig.
I think, I mean, somehow it's interesting, this idea of knowledge transfer, and how a student housing co-op is quite a peculiar type of co-op, exactly because the student is a transient being by definition. So you're a student up to a certain point, so you're moving on. So you no longer qualify, and then as you're asking, can you stay or not? And so that's where maybe the Toronto case has an interest, exactly because of this kind of mixture in which there's a sort of core of people that have been there forever, or can be there forever if they want it, because of rules that you were explaining, that are specific to the city. And then there are others that sort of always rotate around them. So there's, we could almost imagine that there's a core of people where that knowledge resides somehow, that are sort of points of reference. And yet, of course, there's always the flip side, so always the risk that in those people that stay there, some structures of power start some overlapping a little bit too much, let's say. And I don't know if that has actually happened in the case of Toronto, for instance, where you had someone that has been particularly problematic in having to deal with them because they felt like they were the king or the queen of the castle.
Perhaps Janet can speak.
I can actually speak to that a bit. Yes, that definitely does happen. And I think it's probably one of those things that if somebody stays in a particular position or for too long, that they can amass a little too much power. That did happen recently. That person's no longer really in a position of, in a ongoing position anymore. The other thing in terms of kind of like the institutional knowledge and institutional memory, so we kind of have two things. One is the staff and what is actually done from like a business point of view. And so that's like, like maybe building systems and work that's been done and things like that. But then there's just the part about what's happened in the co-op and stories about things that have happened over the years. And we had a member who was our longest, he was our longest member who lived in the building the longest for about 42 years. And he had tons of stories about things that had happened over the year, things that had happened with the board and with other members. And he died almost a year ago. And so that all of that knowledge about things that have happened in the past is, so it's gone in the sense of having somebody who actually lived through it. He did tell people stories, and there was a couple of, there was one of our employees, our community development coordinator, as well as our previous board president, who actually had made a plan. They wanted to sit down with him and document some of these things, and they didn't get around to it in time. And so a lot of that was just passed on word of mouth. And so, and I sort of think, I try to remember what he told me, but, when it's names and places and things that you didn't experience, it's hard to think of all that. But
I think also, I was going to say,
I think too, with staff as well, when you have staff who've been in a position for a long time, which we do, again, they start to accumulate knowledge, which I think, not to necessarily say that it's the most that they're super qualified. It's just that people become afraid that, at the very least, they know about all of these things. And if they're not there, then, what are we going to do? Whether or not that's valid or not, it's hard to say.
Yeah, I think that it brings me to 2 points. Like, anyone living at Neo-Isaac kind of has a certain level of flexibility. You need to understand that new people are coming in and are going to change things maybe entirely because they have a new way of thinking and a new way of doing things. And at the same time, it also for new people coming in, because I've maybe been in both positions, you also suddenly have to understand this new system of who to deal with and who to please to get the thing that you want, and then how to get support from some people to start a party or start an event. And there's a lot of fun in that.
How does decision making work in Neo-Isaac? If you have 800 people, do you decide everything with everyone together, or is it per floor, or is it flats? Or
maybe Janet can explain it a little bit.
So we actually do have like an org chart for Neo-Isaac. So the members are at the top, and then the board of directors, and then it goes down to the general manager, and then the general manager manages the other managers, and there's other managers who manage their staff underneath them. So it depends on what it is.
So sorry, the 800 members are at the top?
Yeah.
The members technically are at the top, but it doesn't mean that the members make all of the decisions. What it means, though, is that the members elect the board of directors. So, which is basically based on, who runs for the board. So the members elect the board. The board is supposed to be involved in the governance. So deciding like the direction that the co-op's going to go. And the staff, they're in charge. So the general manager is in charge of running the operations of the building. So for a lot of just regular ongoing daily things, the general manager doesn't need the board's permission to, pay the bills and decide on, contractors or vendors for just regular work. But if it's something bigger that's going to cost more than $20,000, the general manager is supposed to get it approved by the board. So the board does have and the board is also supposed to be involved in oversight, making sure that the things that are supposed to be getting done are getting done. But for the most part, the board's not supposed to be interfering in the day-to-day operations of the building. So the members' role, what their role comes in, is when the board brings things to the members' meeting to be voted on. So that's like housing charge increases or bylaw changes. So then that information is being put out to the membership, and then the membership's supposed to read the documentation that's being given, and then the members decide. So right now, we have a members' meeting coming up in 2 weeks to raise our housing charges by 4.75%. Now, we normally have a housing charge increase every year, but this one is getting close to double the biggest one that we've had like in the last 25 years. So we're doing some town halls and doing some presentations to the membership to say, like, this is why we're doing this, and this is what our finances have looked like, and this is the money that we need for capital projects. So ultimately, though, it's going to be up to the members to decide to vote to approve it or not approve it.
Okay, I'm a bit mindful of time. I wonder whether we should maybe keep some additional questions at the end of the last session, so we can maybe have a quick, like 5-10 minute break. It's called coffee break. I'm not too sure that there is coffee, but there might be. There should be some food as well coming at some point soon. So I would say thanks everyone for joining this panel, and we'll start again in about 10 minutes perhaps. Thank you very much, Janet, for joining from the other part of the world. Thank you very much.